Hey there, friends. Happy Saturday. Welcome to our June Saturday sermon. I am Jessica. I am one of the trustees over here at Fifth Element Free Church. I am also trustee and director of my own ministry, Misfortune Ministries. For those of you who don't know me or my ministry, I am an astrologer and a spirit medium and an Akashic Records reader. So I am consistently ministering about what's going on in the sky to my friends, my family, my clients, and anybody else who will listen. So I am honored to be delivering a Saturday sermon. It's been a hot minute since I've done one. We are fortunate enough over here at Fifth Element to have many ministries and many talented ministers who have all been delivering sermons for the better part of, I think we're going on 4 years now. And I was able to deliver at least one or two in our very early days, but have had to take a back seat to everybody else for a while. So I was excited to sneak in this month and get at you guys because we have a very important transit coming up that is not something you see every day. In fact, it's one of those once in a lifetime types of transits. And so I thought I would talk to y'all about it. And so that transit is Chiron in Taurus, and I've affectionately referred to the Chiron in Taurus transit as wounds of worth. So let's get into what that is all about. Okay, so Chiron, for those of you who are not familiar, in astrology, Chiron is known as the wounded healer, and mythology as well. And the last time he was in Taurus was from approximately May of 1976 to approximately June of 1983. And I say approximately because as he moves in and out of signs, those moves aren't always clean. We don't always have a clean entrance or exit from one sign to another. Oftentimes there is retrograde motion that kind of carries them back and forth. So that's why those dates are considered to be approximate, because it was the case back then that he moved into Taurus and then retrograded back into Aries, and then moved into Gemini and retrograded back into Taurus on the back end. So you have to kind of be aware that there can be some months on either side of those dates where it's not, like I said, not the cleanest entrance or exit. But he will be returning to Taurus this year for the first time since that microgeneration of humans was born. And that's coming up in just a couple weeks. So he will enter Taurus on June 19th of 2026, and he will dip his toe in, but he won't get too far before he starts his annual retrograde cycle. So in September 17th, to be exact, he will retrograde back into Aries, where he will tie up some loose ends in those last few degrees of the sign. And then next spring in April 14th of 2027, he will return to Taurus for good, and he stays there until approximately July of 2023, when he will start to dip into Gemini. What does this mean? Well, there's a whole bunch of us, and I am one of these folks. I'm a late Gen Xer, and so I will be saying things like we and us probably throughout this presentation. And so that's why. So a whole bunch of us who were born late Gen X, elder millennials, they call us oftentimes the Zennials. We don't really technically fit into either category because we're kind of like our own little micro generation, but we are approaching our Chiron return. And so in astrology, a return happens when a planet comes back to the same location that it occupied at the time that you were born. Okay, so we have one of these bad boys every single year when we celebrate our birthday, right? So that is the sun literally returning to the exact same spot that it occupied at the time of your birth. That's called a solar return. Venus returns once a year. Mars returns once every 2 years. We have lots of returns throughout the course of our life. Some of them are annual, others are, take longer. Saturn, for example, takes approximately 29 years to get around the zodiac. So we usually experience our first Saturn return just before we turn 30. We'll have another one around age 60. And if you live long enough, if you get to be about 90, you'll have a third one of those bad boys. So Chiron, however, is a longer cycle than Saturn, and so he takes approximately 50 years to come full circle around the zodiac. So chances are you will only experience one of these bad boys in your life, and for those of us who are part of this microgeneration, that is coming up, right? As Chiron returns to Taurus, in the coming months and years. Now, this, not coincidentally, the Chiron return tends to coincide with the menopause transition for many women, right? If you follow that progression of maiden to mother to matriarch, those of us who are approaching our Chiron return are moving from mother to matriarch, right? So we're getting into that kind of third and final boss category of matriarch. And let's see here. Okay, so Chiron in Taurus. So Chiron as the wounded healer, and we're going to get into more specifically what that means. Chiron is in Taurus brings a special brand of wounding. And so those of us who have Chiron in Taurus suffer from wounds that concern our overall worth and value, right? So we have a really tough time thinking that we're good enough for things, right? So there's lots of different ways that this can show up, but some examples are, number one, material insecurity, right? So feeling like you never, ever, ever have enough, right? My house isn't big enough, my car isn't big enough, my clothes aren't nice enough, right? All of that. There's just this kind of persistent feeling of lack, right? Two, fears around financial stability. So there is, again, this kind of pervasive lack mentality. You can logically know that you are perfectly fine, right? Your bank account is flush, your retirement is set, but you still can't get rid of this kind of nagging feeling that you do not have enough, or that you won't have enough, that the other shoe is going to drop. Third way that this typically shows up is with body image issues, right? There's always, always, always some flaw that you can hang on to. And that can totally ruin your day. Never feeling like your body or that your looks or your overall appearance are good enough, right? You're never satisfied there. And fourth, is just simply knowing your worth, right? Overall, just not really understanding how important you are to the people that you love, to your coworkers, to your friends, right? So you sell yourself short constantly in all sorts of scenarios. And that is, overall just never a good thing to do. So those of us with Chiron and Taurus constantly struggling with these types of issues. Now I'm going to take a quick kind of side quest, and I'm going to talk to you guys about what we're about to do here. So I use a technique that I didn't really create it, but I think I'm the only one who named it this, where I call it building the master archetype. Now, I'm not sure, if you have experience with astrology, you probably do some form of this already. If you don't have any experience with astrology, then hopefully this will help you, because what we're doing here is we are trying to understand what Chiron in Taurus means. It means like for all of us, but also more specifically for those of us who have Chiron in Taurus. And in order to do that, we have to do what I call building the master archetype. And so there are steps for interpreting planetary placements, right? And what I do when I'm doing this is I take it very sequentially in this order. So the first thing that I ask is, what, right? What is the type of energy that I'm looking at? And that's the planet, right? Two, how is that energy expressing itself? That's going to be the sign. Three, where does the energy tend to show up in my life? That's going to be the house placement. And number four is, are there any additional considerations? So this is going to bring us into kind of more nuanced stuff like, is Chiron retrograde in my chart, for example? Or is he conjunct something, right? Is he really close to my sun? Is he very close to my Venus? Is he opposing my moon? What aspects is he making in the chart? All important things to consider so that you can understand what exactly your particular brand of wounding is. And we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail here, right? So as I said, step one involves looking at the planet, right? What are we talking about? So remember that each planet in astrology has a finite amount of energy. And I see people making this mistake all the time where they overthink it, right? It's so much easier. Astrology is already such a vast topic. There's absolutely no need to overcomplicate it, and so many people do. It's complicated enough, right? So if you can just boil each archetype down, or each piece of the archetype down, into a few key words or phrases, you are going to be just fine. There's no need to kind of go crazy the way that some astrologers do, right? So that finite energy, right? For example, Mercury is going to be thoughts, communications, and the way that we move through life. Venus is love, money, relationship style, right? And keep it simple, because again, we're going to be building. This is just the first of 4 steps. And as you go, it's cumulative, right? So the more complicated you make it at the beginning, the harder it's going to be to put it all together at the end. I am a huge fan of reading up on the mythology around the planets and around the gods and goddesses that these planets are named after. They can really, really help you to understand the nuance of what you're dealing with. And I'm also a big fan of consulting lots of different astrologers who, and their discussions of these different planets and archetypes, because you never know, right? People pull different things from different sources. And so kind of understanding what different people are saying about the archetype is very, very helpful for kind of coming to that which resonates with you the most. All right, step 2, once we've identified the planet and, what that archetype is, we're talking about how. So now we're talking about the sign. The planet that we're talking about, right, in this case, Chiron, is going to stand for the same thing no matter what, right? So Chiron is the wounded healer. He is wounds, and he is the wisdom that we glean from our wounding. And again, we're going to get into that in more detail in a little while. But Chiron stands for that no matter where he goes. However, the filter through which he presents those wounds is going to change based on which sign he's hanging out in, right? So just like every planet, each sign also has its own archetypal energy. And as I said, these planets will carry that same energetic signature no matter where they are, but the expression of that signature is going to change as these planets bump up against the energy of each sign, right? Which is going to be different. So you can see that there will be situations where planets will do much better in one sign versus another, right? So one planet's energy might be really, really effective in, say, Gemini, right? But then it gets to Cancer and it just is like, nope, sorry, we don't, these two things don't vibe well at all, right? So, and I give an example here that says a planet that's moving through Aries is always going to move quickly because the nature of Aries is fast, right? It's fast moving. It doesn't really have time to get distracted. Aries being the first sign of the zodiac, everything kind of just like, just propels from there, and is really kind of has tunnel vision. However, once they get to Taurus, which is the next sign, right, house and sign number 2, they're going to be forced to slow down and be more deliberate because that's the nature of Taurus. Okay, so again, always filtering the planet through the lens of every single sign is going to change the nature of that planet's energy or the way that it is expressed in every single chart. Step 3, this one is, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about steps 3 and 4 in this overall presentation because this is where we really start to differentiate. And so it would take me, 3 hours or more to sit here and tell you how Chiron in Taurus will present if he's in your first house and your 10th house and your 6th house, right? So that, again, this is really where the differentiation starts to happen. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about house placement. And then if this is something that you're interested in, you can always reach out to me and I can talk to you more about what it looks like specifically in your chart. Now, houses is where a lot of people tend to lose the plot in astrology. It adds that kind of additional layer that really tends to confuse people. But one of the best ways that I've ever heard the houses described is that they are the quote unquote field of cosmic combat. So each sign is also a house, and they each stand for an area of our life, of our life. Sorry. And that area of life is going to color the overall expression of the energy in a way that mirrors the energy of the house, right? So as I said, this is where we're going to start to differentiate astrologically, right? And, we're going to have, a lot of us have Chiron in Taurus, but that's going to look different. So, Chiron is the same. Chiron and Taurus, we're all going to have, things that are similar. But for example, for me, Chiron in Taurus is in my 9th house, right? So Chiron in Taurus is going to show up in the area of my life that is concerned with belief systems, okay? Some people have Chiron and Taurus in the first house. That's going to be extremely personal, right? The first house is the house of self. So those wounds are going to be much more personal in nature. Actually, oftentimes Chiron in the first house shows up as actual physical wounding, right? The first house, house of self, speaks very much to the physical presentation of your soul's energy here on earth. And therefore, it is very common for me to see people with Chiron in the first actually have some sort of physical wounding that they are dealing with. Alternatively, you could have them in the 10th house, right? The 10th house is a house of our public image. Sucks to have Chiron basically anywhere, but definitely in the 10th house because everything that we do in the 10th house is extremely public, right? So nobody likes having their wounds on display for all to see, but those who have Chiron in the 10th house, that is exactly what they are dealing with, right? So that's what I mean when I say areas of your life, right? Again, we're just kind of adding to the layers and trying to figure out, where is this wound going to show up for me the most, and how can I, move through it with, taking those things into consideration. Step 4, what else, right? This is kind of that catch-all, right? Where we start to look at aspects, if any. So as I said here, planets, they rarely exist in a vacuum, right? They're often making all sorts of connections to other points and planets in the natal chart. Now, every now and again, you'll have a Chiron or any planet, right, that just simply isn't geometrically touching anything else, but that's pretty rare. And when planets do make angles to each other, or aspects, as we call them in astrology, they will start to influence each other for better or worse, right? So for example, if your natal Chiron is forming an opposition to Saturn, Saturn's influence on Chiron has to be considered, right? That is a person who is going to be dealing with much more significant and harsh Chiron wounds than someone who doesn't have Chiron touching Saturn, right? Similarly, if your Chiron is conjunct your moon, you have to pay attention to the moon's influence. That's a person that's almost certainly going to be dealing with big time mommy issues, right? Because moon is the mothering archetype. And so again, these are all just types of things that you want to be considering as you are moving through the overall evaluation, okay? But for purposes of today and today's sermon, we're going to start building a master archetype for Chiron in Taurus. So we're going to take steps 1 and 2, and then we're not going to go into steps 3 and 4 because, like I said, that's when we really start to differentiate. And so there isn't much that I can say unless and until somebody comes to me with like a very specific like chart presentation, right? But the Chiron in Taurus, steps 1 and 2, that we're going to discuss now, very much apply across the board and to this upcoming transit. So let's dive into this. Okay. Step 1, what planet are we talking about? So remember, we are talking about Chiron, okay? Now, I am a huge fan, as I said, of mythology, and Chiron's mythology is particularly fun. So we're going to go through some of that. So Chiron, again, remember, is a centaur planet. He orbits out, and I'm going to get into what that means in a minute. He orbits out between Saturn and Uranus, and he takes approximately 50 years to make one orbit around the sun. What he represents in astrology is our wounding, but more importantly, the wisdom that we can glean from facing our deepest wounding head on. Okay. All of us come into this earthly experience with wounds. At the very least, we have karmic wounds that we carry over from past lives. And many of us are significantly wounded throughout childhood. And excuse me, even well into adulthood, right? And the question then becomes, when Chiron is triggered, is what do we do with that wounding, right? Do we decide that we're going to sink under the weight of it, or do we lean into it and try to learn from it? So that we don't have to repeat it, or we don't have to pass it on, for example, right? So Chiron energy is extremely bittersweet. There's a lot of learning to be done from Chiron, but in order to access that wisdom, you have to be willing to lean into things that, you might otherwise prefer to bury. So let's talk mythology, because I think, like I said, it helps a lot with the Chiron myth and the overall nuance. So Chiron was a centaur, and the centaurs were the mythological creatures who were half man, half horse. And Chiron was considered to be the wisest and the justest of all the centaurs. He's also frequently referred to as the wounded healer, right? So he was a healer in his own right. Apollo, the god of the sun, taught him the arts of medicine and herbs, also prophecy, so that he could rise above his beastly nature. Ancient Greeks credited him as the father of both botany and pharmacy, so the sciences of herbs and medicine, right? So that healing aspect also comes into play quite literally with Chiron. Now, like the satyrs, who were the half man, half goat creatures in mythology, centaurs were known to be really boisterous and very lustful creatures. But this wasn't the case with Chiron, who was considered to be very intelligent and very civilized. And this is because Chiron wasn't technically related to the rest of the centaurs. Chiron was actually the son of Kronos, who's also known as Saturn, and Philaera, who was an ocean nymph. And it is said that when Philaera gave birth to him, she was so incredibly disgusted and dismayed by his appearance that she immediately abandoned him right after the birth. So the wounding that Chiron is known for starts very, very early in his life. No sooner does he arrive earthside, and he's immediately met with rejection and abandonment by his own mother. Luckily, he was rescued by Apollo and Apollo's twin sister Artemis. So he ended up having a very good upbringing, but that abandonment wound was still there, simmering below the surface throughout his life. Another thing that sets Chiron apart from his centaur brethren in mythology is his immortality. Chiron was effectively a demigod because of his lineage. Remember, Saturn is his father. And so unlike the rest of the centaurs who were mortal, Chiron couldn't die. Now, this becomes important later on in the mythology. Chiron appears throughout Greek mythology. He's a renowned teacher and healer, so he shows up as a character in a lot of the hero stories. He's known for restoring the sight to the phoenix. He took on Achilles and Hercules as disciples, and he's even said to have raised Jason, the famed leader of the Argonauts. But the part of the mythology that's most relevant for our astrological purposes has to do with the leg wound that Chiron receives later in his life. And that changes the overall trajectory of his life. There are several different versions of this particular myth, and you can kind of take whichever one resonates the most. I'll just go over a couple of them, the two most popular. So in one, Chiron is mistakenly shot in the leg with one of Hercules' arrows, which is poisoned with the blood of the Hydra. So he's mortally wounded, but unable to either heal himself or die, right? So he's miserable. And Zeus eventually takes pity on him and allows him to die, placing him in the sky to be honored as the constellation Centaurus. In another version of the myth, Chiron is involved in a great battle, this great battle between the centaurs and their age-old enemies that were known as the Lapiths. And he receives his leg injury after being, again, shot by a poisoned arrow that flew in from the Lapiths' camp. Now, he can't die, so in this version of the myth, he ends up roaming the earth in search of healing. He can't access it. He doesn't really find anybody who can help him out. But in this version of the myth, he does become that master healer because by virtue of having consulted with so many different types of healers, he kind of by osmosis becomes that master healer of others. So no matter which version of the myth you follow or which one resonates most for you, Chiron's astrological lesson is basically this. Everyone's wounded. Some people have physical wounds that they're born with or that they get at any point in their lifetime. Some are emotionally or psychologically wounded in childhood and beyond. And every soul bears karmic wounds from previous lifetimes, wounds that they don't even ever remember incurring, but that are still connected to their soul and, along their soul journey. The point is this: the wound doesn't make you special. It humanizes you. And it absolutely doesn't pay to compare your wounding to others because everyone is fighting their own battles, right? So again, as I mentioned before, when Chiron is triggered in the natal chart, you are presented with a choice. You can sink under the weight of the wound, right? Woe is me. I have this wound. I was abandoned. I was this. I was that, right? And I'll never amount to anything because of this wound, in which case it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Or you can lean into the wound. You can face the wound head on. You can acknowledge it and accept it for what it is, at which point it can begin to teach you things about yourself, right? And about the world around you. And you can then access some form of healing by going out and bringing that wisdom into the world, helping others to heal, right? Being an empathetic ear for people who are suffering from the same type of wounding that you couldn't avoid, right? So there's lots of nice, wonderful, and evolved ways to deal with Chiron's energy. It's just a case of, are you strong enough to rise above that initial trigger? And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't. But when you reach your Chiron return, you are almost certainly going to be presented with that question of whether you have, at this point in your life, gleaned enough wisdom to be able to do that. All right, so step 2, again, we are, so having kind of defined Chiron and his archetype, we now move him through the filter or, put him through the prism of Taurus, right? So how do the planets express themselves through Taurus? And specifically, again, it will be how does the planet Chiron express itself through Taurus? Excuse me. So Taurus is the second sign and therefore the second house of the zodiac, right? Which is, as you probably know, made up of 12 signs and houses. It is ruled by Venus and it is considered to be the fixed earth sign. Now, the earth element is concerned with the material realm, that which we can perceive with our rudimentary senses of taste, touch, sight, smell, etc. And Taurus is the first time that Earth appears on the zodiac wheel. So there's 3 Earth signs. Taurus is first, Virgo second, Capricorn is third, but Taurus being the first of the 3 is our first collective lesson on what it takes for our soul to survive and thrive here in the earthly realm. Now, the zodiac is cumulative, meaning that the lessons of each sign and house build on each other, right? They build from the lessons from the previous signs. And since Taurus is only number 2, that means there's only one sign before it, right? Only Aries precedes Taurus. So in Aries, the soul is embodied, right? We arrive on Earth for another round of BS here on Earth School. That's it, right? That's really all that happens in Aries. In Taurus, our newly embodied soul learns how to keep the soft machine alive, right? It was just gifted with a body, and now we have to figure out how to survive here. Hopefully, throughout the course of the life, the soul masters that lesson, right? How to survive pretty early on, and eventually moves on to learn how to create material abundance for itself, right? So how to thrive. And this is the thrust of Taurus, right? This is really what we're learning here. So key themes that show up in Taurus include financial stability, right? And the ability to manage money, self-worth and core value systems, material comfort, pleasure seeking, the ability to persist through difficulty, using your voice to speak up for yourself, and the ability to identify and gather necessary resources. Again, all with an eye towards learning how to survive, right? So all of those themes are considered to be key in learning how to survive and hopefully thrive here as an embodied soul on planet Earth. All right. And, okay, now, Chiron in Taurus. So what we do now is we're just going to kind of combine these two together, okay? So now remember, Chiron is a sensitive spot. It's a wound. It's a place where you start off behind the 8 ball because the wound was inflicted before you had any means of defending yourself, okay? So this could be karmic, right? This could be a wound that you brought in from a past lifetime. So obviously there was no opportunity for you to defend yourself. It could be a wound that you picked up in early childhood, right? At any point in your life, you can pick up Chiron wounds, although they do tend to be inflicted pretty early. But the point is that, there isn't really anything that you could have done to stop it. You are purely a victim when it comes to Chiron, right? So then the question becomes, okay, you are a victim. Sure, we'll acknowledge that. But are you going to succumb to that victim mentality, or are you going to transform it and learn from it? Okay, so again, Chiron in Taurus people tend towards wounds that center around worth, right, or lack of worth. There's that lack mentality or that scarcity mindset. So even though you are undeniably and objectively abundant, you cannot shake the fear that you're going to lose it all somehow, right? So maybe you hoard. This can also show up as disordered eating, right? I've seen many people with Chiron and Taurus suffer from periods of time where they don't have right relationships towards eating and nutrition. Another one is that they have deep-seated fears around financial stability. So maybe you're terrible with money, right? Like it absolutely just burns a hole in your pocket. Maybe you rack up huge debts, or maybe you simply just don't know how to grow your bank account, right? And make your money work for you. You're scared to invest because you have like a severe risk intolerance, okay? So that fear can show up as just an innate misunderstanding of money as energy and how to make that energy actually work for you. We talked before about body image issues, right? So again, this may or may not tie into the disordered eating that I mentioned before, but at the very least, people with Chiron and Taurus almost always have never been satisfied by the way that they look. Something is always wrong, right? Now, this can be extreme stuff like you think you're too fat or you're too skinny or your shoulders are too broad or your teeth are too crooked. Literally doesn't matter. You will find flaws absolutely anywhere, which overall keeps your self-esteem at a low baseline. If you are constantly nitpicking at your appearance, there's no way you're ever going to rise above a certain baseline self-esteem. And that's extremely problematic because when you have low self-esteem, that spills over into like pretty much every other area of your life. So Chiron and Taurus people have, definitely wrestle with this throughout their lifetime. Knowing your worth, right? This one's huge. You have absolutely no idea how valuable you are. not to your friends, not to your family, not to your boss. You genuinely keep yourself on the clearance rack full time. And by now, if you're guilty of this, you've probably convinced yourself that it's actually humility, but it's not, right? It's not. It's that you genuinely do not know your worth. It's hard for you to know your worth because, again, that wounding is being filtered through the sign of self-worth and self-esteem. Again, Taurus, right? So it becomes a survival issue. Another one, you abandon yourself because you either haven't defined your core values or you don't stick to them when they're challenged, right? So this one shows up everywhere, but it's particularly rough in intimate relationships because it makes you a pushover. If it's really pronounced, you're going to end up as prime fodder for predators because they're going to know, that you simply will not stand your ground in relationships. So again, that's that idea that your self-worth is implicated. And if you have Chiron in Taurus, you don't value your own opinions enough. And so you let other people kind of, bowl you over. Some other manifestations that show up, right? You might be indulgent. You might be hedonistic. You might think that money will solve all your problems. You quit before you should. You fawn, right? That's your go-to kind of trigger response is fawning, or you otherwise fail to speak up for yourself. Right, so all of these can be particularly problematic for those of us who have Chiron in Taurus. Now, I believe, here we go, Chiron Return. Okay, so for those of us who are, who have natal Chiron in Taurus, these issues have been pronounced throughout our lives, and we are moving into a period of time where we can access some healing. So as Chiron moves through Taurus during these next 7 years, these wounds will be ripe for healing. But you have to remember, Chiron wounds can never fully be healed, okay? So don't get caught up in that end game. Don't fool yourself into thinking that, that this is ever just going to go away because, spoiler alert, it won't. The best that you can kind of hope for is that you will come to a better place of acceptance about these wounds and learn how to recognize when they are being triggered for you earlier and earlier as you move through life so that they're not as disruptive and you don't spiral because of them. But the Chiron wound can never be healed, right? That's the most important thing to understand. So the people who, and that's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, there are people who realize that and therefore they sink under the weight of it, right? They adopt that victim mentality. And so that's it. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And then there's the other people who are more than willing to engage in healing, but they do it with this mindset of I'm going to get to a place of healing eventually. And that's also not true, right? And so if you have that as your end game, then you're setting yourself up for failure, which is just as bad, if not worse, than succumbing to the victim mentality in the first place, okay? So just remember that the goal of Chiron is not to heal him, right? Not to heal your wound completely. It's more about coming to a place of acceptance so that you can glean the wisdom, right? The wound is there so that it can alert you to a strength that you have, right? And that you would not be able to access otherwise, right? The wound is actually the source of the wisdom. And so you can't access the wisdom unless you're willing to actually dig into the wound, right? To lean into it and to try to figure out what it is that it's trying to teach you. And that hurts. Right? That hurts. It's not a pleasant process dealing with our Chiron wounds, but it's possible to do it, right? It involves acknowledging the wound, not avoiding it. And then once you do that, you will find that you have the ability to transmute pain into power, fear into freedom, wounds into wisdom, right? I love all of those kind of little catchphrases. A little bit of alliteration for all of us here, right? Pain into power, fear into freedom, wounds into wisdom. That's what Chiron promises you. And so those end games are pretty nice. But again, you have to be willing to go through some pain to get there. And then once you do that, you access the kind of most evolved version of Chiron, which is teaching, right? Becoming that master healer and becoming that master teacher of others. Just because you're wounded doesn't mean that you don't have anything to offer. In fact, that wound and the wisdom that you glean from that wound is so incredibly valuable. But you have to come to a place of acceptance of it first. And once you do, you get put into this position of mentorship, right? Coaching. There's so many different ways that you can show up for others as a Chiron type healer or master. Okay. And so this gets us into what I love. So I don't know, for those of you who don't know, I'm in the program of AA and NA. And the 12th step is very, very Chiron, right? So the 12th step in AA is basically that, having been gifted with a spiritual awakening, I now go out to others and try to help jumpstart that same spiritual awakening in them, right? So bringing the message to people who still suffer. That is literally what Chiron does, right? I am an alcoholic. I will always be an alcoholic. I am, by the grace of God, blessed with a remission of my alcoholism that requires me to be constantly vigilant every day and to continue working on my wounding and not letting it overtake me the way that it did when I was in active addiction and alcohol cycles. And because I was gifted with that wisdom, I now have a responsibility to go out and help people who still suffer, right? That's Chiron. And, you can continue to access that wisdom as long as you are willing to freely give it away, because it's an unlimited source, right? It's not like that wisdom is ever going to run out. And so, your cup runneth over. And so go out into the world, help people, whatever wounding it is that you have, guarantee that there are many, many, many other people in your communities, right? That suffer from those same types of wounds and don't see a way out. So if you are one of those people who has been given a way out, then do yourself a favor, do everybody a favor, and, bring that message to others. And that is really what Chiron is here to teach us, okay? So again, as we move into that Chiron return, those of us who are approaching 50, between now and the year 2033, this is a huge theme that will carry us into that matriarchal phase of our lives. For those of you who do not have Chiron and Taurus, no worries. You will also be seeing these themes cropping up kind of all over the place. And you may be dealing with people who are in that phase of their life. So pays to kind of understand this. And again, if anybody has any questions about Chiron and Taurus, Chiron in general, or just astrology in general, please do not hesitate to hit me up at Misfortune Ministries. I am happy to be of service to everybody, and I hope that you all are well and enjoying your summer. Thanks so much.